Welcome. And a warm welcome to all of you who are in the auditorium, and a special welcome to our 2025 Gifford Lecturer, Professor Alexandra Walsham, and a welcome to all of you who are watching live stream this evening. It's wonderful to see that there are a wide array of people online from overseas, across Europe and across the UK joining us this evening, both students and staff, and a wide array of other attendees. My name is Professor Jeremy Corrett. I'm Professor of Philosophy, Culture and Religion in the School of Divinity and Head of the School of Divinity, and also a member of the Gifford Lecture Committee. And it's my pleasure to host this second in the 6 lecture series of the 2025 Gifford Lectures. It's also a special privilege to welcome Professor Walsham this evening, because this actually is the second time I've had the privilege of welcoming and hosting Professor Walsham. The first time was back in 2022, when she gave the second Ecclesiastical History lecture at the Centre for Anglican History and Theology in Canterbury. And during that lecture, I saw, as I did last night, the wonderful ability that she brings in holding together social history with ecclesiastical history. And I think we've already seen in the first lecture how that incredible long history of linking motion and emotion sets us up for what is already billed to be an extraordinary exploration of religious movements. And this evening we will take that a step further, literally, a step on a journey. Professor Alexandra Walsham is the 1930 Professor of Modern History and Fellow at Emmanuel College, Cambridge University. And it's wonderful that these lectures set us on a particular kind of journey, thinking through the Reformation history. And this evening, that Reformation history will take a focus on journeys themselves and medieval tradition of journeys and how they were transformed by the Reformation. And more significantly, how there was a shift from the physical journey into the inner journey. And another dimension of that rich connection that I've often seen in Professor Walsham's work is the bringing together of that social history. And at the end of the lecture, we will see a concentration on how the poor and the marginalized become part of that incredible narrative and insignificant part of the journey, inner and outer. And it also signals the strength of Professor Walsham's work to speak to a theme of our time, a theme about migration and movement. So will you all join me this evening in welcoming for the second lecture in this 2025 Gifford Lecture Series, Professor Alexandra Walsham. Welcome.
Thank you so much. The journey has always been a powerful metaphor for the Christian life. Physical movement through space is often equated with the process of spiritual development, which people undergo over time as they progress towards a deeper understanding of the divine. The Bible is filled with the journeys undertaken by the Lord's people and by Christ's disciples to flee persecution, seek asylum, find the promised land, and spread the word of the gospel. It describes journeys into the wilderness of temptation and sin, as well as journeys in search of salvation. It contains many references to the competing pathways of righteousness and evil into which the faithful are led by God and the wicked are lured by the devil. It speaks of walking in the commandments and running the race that is set before us. It deploys pilgrimage as a shorthand for the passage from the cradle to the grave. Jesus' own journey to Calvary is the ultimate pattern for Christian imitation. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Christ tells his disciples that they must deny themselves, take up the cross, and follow me. Scripture is thus saturated with the language of travel. Etymologically, the word travel sits in close kinship with travail. To travail is to undertake a work requiring effort, pain, hardship, or suffering. In the 16th and 17th centuries, it had particular associations with the labour of childbirth. Accompanied by trouble and tribulation, it aptly evokes the arduous nature of the human journey of faith. It alerts us to the intimate links between motion and emotion in early modern culture. This was a period marked by restless mobility. People were constantly in motion within their immediate localities, but also across borders and increasingly around the globe. This lecture considers the intertwined histories of pilgrimage, travel, and itinerancy. It probes the intersection between journeys of the body and journeys of the imagination, spirit, and soul, approaching both as forms of emotional practice which forged senses of religious identity. It juxtaposes analysis of the physical pathways and virtual voyages pursued by men and women from across the confessional spectrum, with an investigation of the moral anxieties that surrounded travel of other kinds, including the fears provoked by poor and marginal people who seemed to be incessantly on the move. It explores the paradox that movement was simultaneously essential to the spiritual growth of the Christian and a source of deep unease. The Reformation transformed the theology of mobility. It confessionalized motion and invested it with renewed ambivalence. Rest and stasis were signs of religious inertia, but they were also the foundation of social and political order. Pilgrimage has a long history within Christianity. Its emergence in late antiquity attested to a growing desire to encounter the sacred. But this remained in tension with a countervailing conviction that physical journeys were a dangerous distraction from the inner quest for spiritual perfection that should preoccupy every Christian. In the Middle Ages, pilgrimage to Jerusalem and the Holy Land flourished alongside visits to Rome. Other major shrines became the destination of devout travellers, including Santiago de Compostela and Canterbury. Pilgrimages endorsed by the ecclesiastical authorities coexisted with unofficial ones, made to local sites in the natural landscape, such as hallowed wells, trees and stones. Existing cults competed with newer ones. Some were orchestrated, others sprang up spontaneously in the wake of miraculous events. Sacred images also had a well-known propensity to shift their location in the face of danger or when their celestial patrons were dissatisfied with their earthly custodians. Migrations of this kind are constituent features of medieval legends of shrine formation. A pilgrim is a person who comes from foreign parts, travels to distant places, and sojourns among strangers. The Latin root of pilgrimage, peregrinatio, alludes to a state of mental alienation from the regular rhythms of worldly existence. Much has been written about the role of pilgrimage as a rite of passage and as a liminal phenomenon. It has influentially been described as a form of extroverted mysticism. But there were other motives for undertaking religious journeys. Part of an economy of salvation in which humans had agency, pious mobility was a means of earning spiritual merit, including indulgences. Laborious travel was also a mode of penance and was often undertaken on barefoot. People often went in fulfillment of a vow or to give thanks for a mercy or deliverance. Others hoped for thaumaturgic cures. The abandoned crutches that littered shrines were tokens of the heartfelt gratitude of those whose prayers were granted. As Chaucer's Canterbury Tales attests, a spirit of curiosity, recreation, and adventure also frequently came into the equation, though it's unwise to try to disentangle these from piety too precisely. Pilgrimage was a sensual and affective phenomenon. The faithful yearned to touch and see the sacred. as narrative accounts and images of people crawling, kissing, and even licking tombs and relics reveal. Penitential journeys were watered with shameful tears of contrition. Therapeutic ones sometimes ended with outpourings of joy. The emotional tropes that fill pilgrimage guides illuminate the powerful feelings prompted by these religious movements. The fervour of visitors to the miracle-working shrine of the Virgin and Child at Regensburg around 1520 is captured in this dramatic engraving. Some are overcome with emotion and lie prostrate or writhing on the ground. Others raise their arms and hands in corporeal gestures of prayer and adoration. Pilgrims were trampled to death in the surge to gain access, and officials worried about the disorderly zeal of devout wayfarers who progressed through towns and villages, comparing this with the wanderings of idle vagabonds. They were profoundly suspicious of the feverish compulsion that drew so many to visit popular shrines, such as the Holy Blood shrine at Wilsnack in Saxony, including in 1475 hundreds of children. On the eve of the Reformation, the culture of pilgrimage was exposed to searching critique by humanists and heretical dissidents, including the Lollards and Hussites. To humanists, they were frivolous expeditions that smacked of superstitious materialism. For the latter, journeys to stocks and stones were a flagrant form of idolatry and a demonstration of the corruption of the clergy who promoted them. Critics deplored those who gathered and trotted to shrines and declared that this was destructive to their souls. Too many people went on pilgrimage more for the green way than for devotion. It became a commonplace to say that one could seek salvation more effectively by staying at home. According to the English Lollard, William Thorpe, true pilgrims were not those who went on fruitless excursions abroad, but those who travelled towards the bliss of heaven. These objections gathered momentum with the advent of Protestantism, which precipitated a vigorous assault upon the tradition of sacred peregrination. Reformers compared popish pilgrimage to whoring after idols. In their eyes, this form of spiritual fornication was often the prelude to carnal fornication. True Christians, they said, did not waste effort in running hither and thither. Either individual shrines were dismantled and miraculous images, such as the famous rood of Boxley Abbey in Kent, which bent its body and moved its eyes and lips, were publicly exposed as fraudulent mechanical contrivances designed to delude unwitting pilgrims. Such scandals contributed to a mood of wary circumspection within the Church of Rome, which brought about a temporary hiatus in Catholic religious mobility. But by the 1560s, its value was being boldly reasserted by the resurgent papacy and harnessed to fight back against the advance of heresy. Promoted by the Wittelsbach dynasty, the Marian shrine of Altötting was promoted as a symbol of Bavaria's salvific history, while the Virgin of Mariazell in Austria similarly became a focal point for antagonism towards both Protestantism and Islam. Long-distance pilgrimages to Mont Saint-Michel recommenced and acquired a confessional edge in the wake of the French wars of religion. Just as the archangel had vanquished the devil, so would Catholicism conquer Calvinism. In 1602, 800 people travelled there to give thanks for its triumph over the Huguenots. Journeys to this rocky island were hazardous because of the shifting sands and treacherous tides, but for many, the personal peril involved in attempting it made it even more meritorious. By the mid-17th century, more than 80,000 pilgrims were arriving each year. Pilgrimage to Mont Saint-Michel became a vector of Tridentine devotion. Those who visited it were urged to travel with fervour, but also sobriety, decorum, and penitence. Bodily motion was understood as a means of infusing divine grace into the soul. The physical act of visiting and venerating sacred sites and monuments, such as those in Rome, was understood to have emotional effects. Those like Gregory Martin, who defended the practice of Christian peregrination against the incredulity of the heretics, spoke of the joy that melted them, the force that ravished, pierced, and stirred their hearts, and the sensible feeling of heavenly devotion that came from being in proximity to the remains of the saints. Protestants' abhorrence of pilgrimage demonstrated that they were brutish men who had no feeling of the Spirit at all. These trends also found expression in the Counter-Reformation cult of the Holy Mountain. In Italy, pilgrimages to Monteverna permitted pious visitors to experience the Passion of Calvary vicariously by climbing to its peak. A host of other Sacri Monti sprang up across Europe like mushrooms. These miniature replicas of Jerusalem recreated the Stations of the Cross via a series of chapels and life-size tableaux, which allowed the faithful to pause for prayer and contemplation as they ascended the slopes, and to feel Christ's own agony as they retraced the footsteps of his sacrifice for humanity. For those unable to make the journey themselves, elaborate prints with movable flaps were produced, designed to evoke the disorientation of the senses associated with ascending steep hillsides, and as here, to bring the viewer to a deeper understanding of the temptations of Christ and St. Francis. This was another variety of mobile piety. In contexts where Catholicism was a clandestine minority, people adapted pre-existing traditions of religious mobility. In England and the Netherlands, they continued to frequent abandoned chapels and ruined monasteries and to circumambulate them, often carrying devotional aids such as rosary beads or decade rings. Ejected from churches, they made the rooms of their homes, gardens, and the natural landscape into new places of pilgrimage. Meanwhile, the route travelled by priests to their martyrdoms acquired the character of a via sacra. In the 1580s, the York matron Margaret Clitheroe went on barefoot to Knavesmire, outside the city, where Catholic missionaries were executed. Some medieval shrines defiantly survived the Reformation, including St. Patrick's Purgatory in Loch Derg in Ireland. Visitors continued to flock there, eager to undergo the purifying ordeal of spending 24 hours incarcerated in a dark cave. The 10 days of severe austerity on the island that preceded this were accompanied by groaning, sighing, sobs, and copious tears. In the emotional economy of pilgrimage, genuine encounters with the holy were legitimized by the affections they provoked and the bodily forms these took. The revival and spread of early modern Catholicism fostered new pilgrimage cults in both the Old World and the New. In Europe, the recently excavated Roman catacombs supplied territories reclaimed from Protestantism with relics to fill the void left by those lost to iconoclasm. The remains of these ancient martyrs on the move, as Simon Ditchfield puts it, joined those of contemporary priests and lay people who died for their faith. Relic translation is one aspect of what Karen Vellers has called the miracle of portable Catholicism. The dissemination of devotion to the Holy House of Loreto highlights the role that pilgrimage played in this process. The story of its miraculous movements begins in the late 13th century, when the humble mud brick abode in which the Virgin had received the Annunciation and conceived the Son of God was carried by angels from Nazareth to escape the threat of Muslim incursion. It landed in Dalmatia in 1291. A few years later, it flew across the Adriatic Sea to Ancona, and after several shorter hops, settled permanently in Loreto in 1296. Its strange transportations became the stuff of myth. Devotion to the cult grew rapidly and propagated offshoots across the continent. including one just north of Edinburgh in Musselburgh. In 1533, a former crusader turned hermit brought a small part of the sacred roof from Loreto and later built a shrine, which acquired royal patronage and attracted pilgrims until, as one writer commented, Calvin's pestiferous doctrine began to rage and reign in that kingdom, leading to its demise and demolition in 1590. After the Reformation, the original Holy House of Loreto remained a premier destination for religious visitors. Its history was written by the Italian Jesuit Orazio Torcellino, and the Frenchman Louis Richomme prepared a best-selling guide entitled Le Pèlerin de Lorette. Like other medieval shrines, Loreto's resurrection was celebrated as evidence of Catholicism's divine endorsement. Punitive miracles against those who sacrilegiously violated it were widely publicised. Torcellino and Richomme's books were both translated into English for the welfare of our distressed country. In the 1630s, a series of broadsides summarising the legend of the shrine, derived from an original by Pietro Terramano, appeared for the benefit of British readers. The one in Low Scots is entitled The Wondrous Flitting of the Kirk of Our Blessed Lady. The linguistic journeys traced by these texts neatly paralleled the migrations of the house, as well as the mobility of British Catholics themselves. Loreto's movements were not, however, confined to Europe. The many exquisitely accurate reproductions of the house erected across the early modern world are emblematic of its status as a cult in motion and as a carrier of global Catholicism. One established in Quebec in 1674 incorporated mud slabs imported from Italy in an effort to simulate the experience of touching, feeling, and kissing it as closely as possible. This was envisaged as a device for converting the Huron people to Christianity. The first holy house in Latin America was established in the Mexican port city of Veracruz. Others appeared in California, Arizona, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and Chile, in conjunction with Jesuit missions, but also with the energetic involvement of indigenous peoples. Pilgrims ended their journeys to these places by crawling around the building on their knees. These embodied devotions were a way of joining with fellow devotees of Mary, divided by time and space in shared cultures of prayer. The Loreto cult also reflects the revitalization of movement as a metaphor for the journey of Christian life. As Richomme commented, all men were mere travellers on earth, walking towards the grave, but wise pilgrims directed their gaze towards the heavenly kingdom. He wrote for those who made real trips to holy places, as well as those wishing to embark on a virtual voyage of the memory in mind. Building on an older medieval tradition, imagined itineraries to Jerusalem were on the rise. Within the domain of the cloister, enclosed nuns integrated these into their devotional routines, but the same was true outside it. François de Sales structured his famous treatise, An Introduction to the Devout Life, as a journey of spiritual growth, modelled on the travels of the biblical figure of Tobias, to whom God sent an angel to guide him. So too did the Spanish Dominican Luis de Granada in a text entitled La Guía de Pecadores, published in 1555. Written in 1566, Teresa of Avila's The Way of Perfection provided instructions for directing the affections towards the end of salvation. Movement was also the underlying template for Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises, a means of interpreting and training the motions felt by the person undertaking them. They involved visualizing key episodes in Christ's life over a period of 40 days. As the preface to the English edition commented, they enabled one to move and to walk anew. The pilgrimage to perfection, described by the 16th century Carmelite St. John of the Cross, took the form of a 10-day voyage into solitude, during which believers were to mortify the senses and passions and reunite themselves with the Holy Spirit. The shift to interiority to which these publications attest should not be overstated. Spiritual imagining and physical journeying coexisted, though emphasis was increasingly placed less on the final destination than on the process of getting there, key to which was the experience of feeling pious movements inside the soul. The forms of introverted and extroverted mysticism that flourished in the Counter-Reformation world were both intensely emotional in tone. The Reformation has sometimes been credited with bringing an abrupt end to the practice of pilgrimage. Martin Luther fiercely repudiated the idea that it was a meritorious act that carried salvific agency. Like heretics and humanists before him, Protestants denied that sanctity could be acquired by undertaking a journey and denounced the disorderly wanderings of pilgrims as popish superstition. The Elizabethan homily against the peril of idolatry condemned the madness of men who, even in our time, in so great light of the gospel, could be found running on the heaps by sea and land to the great loss of their time, expense and waste of their goods, destitution of their wives, children and families, and danger of their own bodies and lives, to visit dumb and dead stocks and stones. The clergy were urged to exhort their parishioners that they would please God more by the true exercise of their bodily labour, travail or occupation than by travelling to shrines, and that it would profit more their soul's health if they gave offerings to the poor instead. Note the contrast here between the worthy toil of one's earthly vocation and the idle frivolity of travel. Savagely sarcastic attacks continued to be launched on Catholicism's premier holy sites, including the Holy House of Loreto. This publication, dated 1677, entitled A New Year's Gift for Papists, reproduces the text of the Scottish broadside we saw earlier, together with some sharp animadversions to demonstrate to Protestants the gross stupidity of stories of the chapel's wondrous removes, and to expose the abominable impostures by which Rome ensnared its seduced votaries. Redeployed figuratively to describe the internal journey of the soul, however, the concept of pilgrimage survived the Reformation. Translated from the domain of space to time, it re-emerged as a paradigm for the life cycle of faith and regeneration. Arthur Dent's Plain Man's Pathway to Heaven is one of many didactic dialogues modelled on a journey in which one character is converted from ignorance and error to real understanding and true devotion by the end. Many such pathways to perfection, salvation, justification, piety, prayer, and knowledge appeared, feeding an appetite for guidance about how to walk in the way of God and his commandments. The Northamptonshire Puritan gave directions for a comfortable walking with God in 1625, and the Shropshire divine Edward Berry Help to Holy Walking, or A Guide to Glory, appeared in 1675. Contrasting the inertia and stasis of a life mired in sin, these works liberally exploited the vocabulary of locomotion. A pamphlet published in Glasgow in 1700 provided advice on watching the heart, taking heed of unruly passions, resisting temptation, and attending upon the motions of the spirit. Such books reflected the restless pursuit of the zealous for emotional reassurance that they numbered among the elect. Others referred to the Pauline image of the race for the prize or crown of salvation. The text of Philippians 3:14, which exhorts the Christian to forget that which is behind and endeavour thyself to that which is before, and follow hard towards the mark inspired this piece of biblical iconography on a Devon chimneypiece. In 1662, the Presbyterian Thomas Manton said that in the Christian life there could be no lying, sitting or standing, but still there must be running. Itinerancy was an integral feature of Quaker identity, and Friends spoke frequently of walking in the light. The Baptist John Bunyan's Heavenly Footman, 1698, tells its readers that they must run a long and tedious journey through the vast howling wilderness before they come to the land of promise. His more famous allegory, Pilgrim's Progress, describes Christians' dangerous peregrination to the eternal city, in the course of which he passes through Vanity Fair, the Vale of Humility, the Valley of the Shadow of Death, and the plain called Ease. Pilgrimage exerted enduring influence as an imaginative trope in the Protestant world. But its vitality as a metaphor for spiritual development should not obscure the ongoing importance of physical movement as an embodied religious practice after the Reformation. Rejection of popish pilgrimage was entirely compatible with acknowledging that some types of travel could be valuable aids to piety. This is the context in which the persisting practice of visiting Jerusalem must be situated. Luther considered it a symbol of true religion, and he even expressed an unfulfilled wish to visit it. Calvin said that contemplating Christ's passion at the historical sites where it occurred was a legitimate pious act. The German apothecary Leonard Graulwolf said that the sight of Calvary had a particular capacity to stir up affections in every true Christian who stands there and remembers the crucifixion, death, burial, and resurrection. Visiting biblical lands enabled believers to experience the eschatological events surrounding humanity's redemption directly. Some even brought home souvenirs. This small box of gravel and rocks from the Holy Land in the collections of the Danish Museum in Copenhagen is suggestive of practices that intertwined erudition with evangelical devotion and provided Orthodox Lutherans with a tactile link to the locus of their salvation. So is the personal pilgrimage certificate which the Nuremberg magistrate Lucas Friedrich Behem went to the trouble to obtain from the Guardian of Jerusalem and carefully preserved in his family archive. One native of Hamburg even had his arms decorated with tattoos to mark his visit in 1669. When the English traveller Fynes Moryson reached the city in 1596, he was struck with a religious horror that filled his mind with holy motions and prepared it for devotion. Another manifestation of Protestant pilgrimage was the burgeoning scholarly interest in sacred geography. The aim of Heinrich Bunting's Itineraries of Sacred Scripture, first published in German in 1581, was to enable its readers to imagine themselves in the landscape in which Jesus had been born and become man, and through which the wise men and the holy apostles had travelled. In truth, who rightly takes this to heart and studies it will be overwhelmed by a vast love and not be able to wonder enough at such great humility of the divine majesty. Perusing this book was self-consciously envisaged as an effective experience. The maps of Christ's journeys and the peregrinations of St. Paul around the Mediterranean, incorporated in many Protestant Bibles, may be seen in the same light. The example on the right even indicates the distance that Paul had travelled in miles. Biblical cartography encouraged people to imagine themselves in the spiritually charged settings described in the Old and New Testaments, including the Garden of Eden itself. In marrying piety with empiricism, this form of religious movement was a mode of knowledge acquisition that parallels the activities of early modern antiquaries. The early modern era saw a mobility's turn of its own, as scholars complemented their study of records and books with active fieldwork, often carried out on foot. The stationary labour of sitting in archives and libraries and the peripatetic practice of travelling to observe artefacts and landmarks that provided vital clues to distant history were symbiotically linked. John Leland's laborious journey and search, posthumously published in 1549, describes how he was inflamed by zeal to see England's memorable places, but also by regret that so many worthy monuments had miserably perished in the spoil wrought by the dissolution of the monasteries. Even as he celebrated the downfall of Sodometros abbeys and friaries, he lamented the many lively memorials of our nation that had been swept away alongside them. A similar amalgam of pity and prejudice is present in William Lambarde's Perambulation of Kent of 1576. Lambarde's text combines a violent critique of the peevish miracles and lying fables perpetuated by the papists, with a sense of sorrow at the decay of the once flourishing city of Canterbury. His book is a kind of anti-pilgrimage, tinged with ambivalence. Later antiquarian works were likewise suffused by a yearning for the repudiated medieval past that was in the process of being lost. Two further forms of post-Reformation pilgrimage deserve attention. The first are the continuing journeys that Protestants made to mineral springs and baths renowned for their healing properties. Some of these had a previous incarnation as holy wells dedicated to a patron saint. The cold spring at St Anne's at Buxton in Derbyshire was suppressed in the reign of Henry VIII, but actively rehabilitated as a spa in the 1570s, assisted by a gentleman sponsor and a Welsh physician. In Denmark, the ongoing impulse to visit formerly hallowed waters was accorded a new medical rationale that permitted their use because of their natural health-giving qualities. Christian IV lent the royal imprimatur to the Helene spring in the small town of Tisvilde in 1639. Other incipient healing springs proved short-lived. One writer attributed the declining efficacy of a well in Newnham Regis in Warwickshire to the great concourse of people who came there with misguided opinions, much like the superstition of our forefathers, which in old time accounted their pilgrimages sufficient for the curing of maladies. But resort to such sites was shaped by religious convictions that heralded them as providential gifts and stressed that their beneficial effects were contingent on divine will and contrite repentance. Prayers imploring the assistance of the Lord as a loving Father were said twice daily at the fountains of Hornhausen near Halberstadt. It was reported in 1646 that 5,000 visitors had come, overwhelming the site with a world of coaches and wagons. A certain General Torstenson, who went there in a litter, had apparently returned from it on horseback, fully recovered. At Knaresborough, later better known as Harrogate, a crippled woman called Maud Bogg, who was brought there unable to walk, went back to York on foot, and there trotted up and down the city as if she had never ailed anything. Resident physicians criticised the giddy precipitation of the meaner sort of people who rushed to these springs. This contrasted sharply with a regimen of orderly movements they recommended visitors follow in between drinking or bathing in the waters, which they commended for their ability to make bodies fit to endure new travails and labours. A doctor who promoted the well at Peterhead near Aberdeen in the 1630s urged patients to aid their digestion by the recreation of walking and moderate exercise, as well as to flee perturbation of mind. Visiting medicinal sites of this kind was a source of pleasure and ease, but in accordance with humoral theory, the therapeutic success of such journeys was also dependent on maintaining emotional equanimity. Secondly, Protestantism engendered more pedestrian forms of mobility. Feet continued to serve as devotional tools. Walking, to quote the anthropologist Tim Ingold, is a way of thinking, knowing, and feeling. The Church of England retained the liturgical perambulation of parish boundaries at Rogatiantide, an annual ceremonial rite that recreated the community through a collective act of shared movement. Godly people retreated to fields, woods, and gardens to find solace and silence. The dissenter John Rastrick's regular constitutionals in the late 17th century led him to delightful, soul-refreshing converse and meditation. Others undertook journeys in company with fellow believers. Puritans frequently travelled significant distances to sermons in other churches and combination lectures in market towns, seeking additional spiritual nourishment. Their critics described this using the vernacular word gadding, which has connotations of idle wandering and of madly rushing about. In an echo of the worries that surrounded medieval pilgrimage, some suspected that this led to sexual promiscuity. Once again, the parallels between the rhythms of older traditions of religious peregrination and these new ones were not lost on contemporary observers who disapproved of them. The associated phenomenon of fast days involving marathon sessions of preaching and walking communions also caused crowds to flock across the countryside. A Jesuit who witnessed one such gathering from his prison cell window at Wisbech described how many came with horses and pack animals burdened with a multitude of Bibles. However, it was in 17th and 18th century Scotland, Ulster, and America that revivalist meetings to receive the Eucharist and hear the word preached reached their peak. Some of these holy fairs attracted throngs of as many as 50,000 people, who came with a great zeal and a vehement appetite, and were rewarded by powerful soul movements. Itinerant ministers wrought strong and unusual motions in their hearers, some of whom fainted, while others experienced bodily pangs and throes. Tossed from deep soul perplexity to transfiguring ecstasies, those who participated in them remembered these as times of quickening and upstirring. They compared them with pilgrimages and wilderness journeys. Movement thus remained at once an intrinsic and an ambivalent feature of Protestant piety. But early modern cultures of mobility also stimulated moral, social, and religious anxieties. It's the trouble with travelling that I turn in the last part of this lecture. This was the era of the Grand Tour and of a burgeoning interest in travel for leisure and educational purposes. The strategy of sending the young abroad to experience the glories of classical antiquity and the Italian Renaissance gathered pace in the 17th century and reached its height in the 18th. Travel was conceived of as a finishing school for humanist-trained youth from northern Protestant Europe. Synonymous with cosmopolitan, sociability, and politeness, it's often been slotted into a lingering narrative of the secularization of travel and separated from the study of pilgrimage. But recent work has highlighted the enduring spiritual dimensions of tourism. If such journeys were a means of enlarging the mind and widening horizons, they also fostered confessionalization and religious regeneration. The fears that some parents harbored about their capacity to pervert or dilute the piety of their children must be set alongside the conviction, articulated by the Protestant convert Thomas Bell, that to go from place to place, to learn experience, civil manners, customs, and laws of other countries is a godly act and highly to be commended. While acknowledging travel as a route to wisdom, contemporary writers also warned about the ideological, ethical, and sensual temptations to which tourists were exposed, including illicit sexual liaisons. Others worried that they would give way to impatient affections and encouraged those embarking on journeys to purge themselves of ill humours and mischievous passions, lest one be infected with exotic contagions. Concerns about the danger of being perverted by popery and being led into atheism were even more prominent. A mid-17th century set of directions to a son advised travellers to avoid engaging in disputes about religion and interacting with unbelieving scoffers. It urged people to keep their zeal chained, enter churches warily, and ensure that they did not neglect their private devotional duties. They advocated forms of linguistic moderation and behavioural dissimulation designed to hide their real religious identities, which bore an affinity with condemned ways of lying, such as equivocation. Bishop Joseph Hall's Quo Vadis strongly censured civil and curious travel and laid out the hazards it presented to the Protestant faith in detail. He urged young gentlemen to be happy at home. To run abroad like water was the curse of Reuben in the Bible. Motion, said Hall, is ever accompanied with unquietness, and both argues and causes imperfection, whereas the happiest state of heaven is described by rest, whose glorious spheres in the meantime do so perpetually move that they are never removed from their places. This clever paradox allowed Hall to reconcile his argument with the precept that Christian life was an unending pilgrimage. This finds expression in a devotional guide dated 1700, subtitled Travelling Spiritualized, which instructed young men on how to navigate the long and dangerous journey towards spiritual safety. Hall's instructions, meanwhile, were summarised in this broadside, intended to prevent popish and debauched principles in Protestant travellers. Item 33 wished that God would enkindle our hearts with a fire of holy zeal, but so much as Satan hath inflamed theirs with a fire of fury and faction. He envisaged travellers as emotional beings. Tourism served to reinforce negative national stereotypes and anti-Catholic prejudices. It cemented Italy's reputation as a sink of iniquity and the seat of the tyrannous Inquisition, and it fostered the image of popery as a perverse anti-religion. Travel accounts reiterated the idea that the clergy kept the laity in thrall by dazzling their senses and whipping up excessive emotions. The relics and legends linked with the Holy House of Loreto were regularly rehearsed as evidence of the superstition reformed travellers aboard. In this sense, travel journals were akin to the anti-pilgrimages of polemical antiquaries. The reverse movements of 17th century Italian Catholic tourists to Scandinavia, meanwhile, evince a mixture of anxiety about cultural contamination and admiration for the decorous quality of Lutheran worship. Hostility to heresy and to what they called the pagan savagery of the Sami people was intermixed with a detached interest in difference and a wish to avoid friction. Some travel journals are akin to spiritual diaries. The devout Scottish Presbyterian, Sir John Clerk, interwove an account of his European journeys with memories of the signal providences that had been bestowed upon him, including his escape from drowning after foolishly jumping into the Seine in Paris and trying to swim. These strengthened his conviction that Rome was a den of buggery, which was as rife as fornication in Scotland, and a place where Satan has set up his throne conspicuously. The inner lives of early modern travel remained strongly shaped by inherited negative assumptions. Those who journeyed beyond Europe to the Indian subcontinent, America, or China saw the cultures they encountered through the lens of existing ideas about idolatry and diabolism. The ethnographic texts and images they sent back are a species of Christian Orientalism. In turn, popular chapbooks about Jerusalem journeys were infused with strands of anti-Judaism. This one on the left began by remarking how signally the hand of the Almighty has been stretched out against the Jews. Travel to Muslim lands, including Mecca, activated distaste for Islam. The emotional experience of visiting them was coloured by a sense of spiritual superiority. The Grand Tour was a rite of passage to masculine adulthood that reinforced religious and patriotic feeling by confronting people with the others against which their own nations and faiths defined themselves. The visits of Dutch tourists to the sites of Huguenot defiance and martyrdom in France and to Geneva helped to entrench their commitment to the beleaguered cause of international Calvinism. But travel also precipitated the medical and emotional affliction that was homesickness. This was a disease triggered by displacement and a malady induced by movement. Intercultural interactions were embodied and had effective consequences, and these cannot easily be unravelled from the piety of those who experienced them. Another kind of nostalgia was felt by British Protestants who stayed at home and visited the mouldering monasteries and crumbling ruins that littered their own landscape. These spectacles transported them back to a medieval Christian world that was slipping into oblivion. The itineraries of curiosity that oiled the wheels of domestic tourism in the 18th century reflected new aesthetic sensibilities that had religious dimensions of their own. The thrilling sensations that visitors to the Peak District felt on hearing thunderous echoes, and the sweet solitude they sought in sylvan glades helped to cultivate Anglican and dissenting spiritualities linked with the appreciation of nature fostered by physico-theology. Below the level of the elite, travel was an everyday quotidian reality. People were constantly on the move, within and beyond their own localities, to attend markets and fairs, carry and sell goods, engage in seasonal labour and search for work in Europe's swelling cities. This included domestic servants, journeymen, merchants, minstrels and peddlers. In a context of economic crisis and demographic pressure, subsistence migration was on the rise. These movements promoted moral and religious misgivings of their own. As reflected in the rise of legislation and local regulation of vagrancy and vagabondage, the mobility of the poor was a source of ongoing disquiet and growing unease. The incapacity of the deserving poor to work and to walk contrasted with the unwillingness of the undeserving poor, who were whole and might in body and able to labour. Such sturdy beggars and rogues were defined by their idle and purposeless wandering through the countryside. As one writer noted, they will abide nowhere, but runneth up and down from place to place, to and fro all over the realm. In societies in which sedentary status was perceived as vital for stability, vagrancy was regarded as a seed of peril and tumult in a state. Masterless men and women without a fixed place of abode posed a threat to patriarchal and political order. Instead of travelling, they should be travailing in a settled vocation. The severe punishments instituted in towns and cities across the continent, including whipping, ear-boring, branding, imprisonment and banishment, attest to the close links that existed between mobility, marginality and immorality. In an echo of the criticisms levelled at pilgrims, they were linked with sexual sins, profane life and petty crimes, and accused of spreading disease. The fake certificates and licenses that these itinerants sometimes carried with them exposed them to charges of fraudulent pretense and deceit. Some told how they consorted together as beasts. Fact merged with fiction in the picaresque literature that taxonomized the fraternity of vagabonds and classified them into what were described as a series of sects. This genre was initiated by the Liber Vagatorum of 1510, which Luther had reprinted in 1527. The very process of labelling and stigmatising vagrants helped to bring them into being as a delinquent minority and to make them the subject of fear and anxiety. The same observation might be made about the people we now know as travellers, gypsies and Roma. Our capacity to reconstruct this shadow community is similarly constrained by the hostile sources through which we're compelled to view it. The geographical roots of those who called themselves Egyptians are obscure, but are now understood to lie in northwestern India, from whence they migrated into Persia and then the Ottoman and Byzantine empires. However, the question of their origin was increasingly eclipsed in contemporary discourse by the problem of their mobility. When these peripatetic people reached a new location, they explained their nomadic lifestyle in terms designed to appeal to Christian ears, describing themselves as pilgrims, condemned to roam the earth as penance for refusing to shelter Mary and Joseph in their homeland in Egypt. In England, as in France, Italy, the Holy Roman Empire and the Iberian Peninsula, gypsies became the targets of intensifying repression in the early modern centuries. Edicts, statutes, and decrees against these outlandish figures, who travelled in small bands on foot or horseback, shifted from treating them as foreign aliens to denouncing them as wicked, devilish, and ungodly vagrants. In Germany, they were sometimes equated with heathens, and in 1566, the Provincial Council of Ravenna condemned them as a race of wandering people steeped in every impiety. In Counter-Reformation Rome, though they had no clear religious confession, they were integrated into a wider program to convert souls and reclaim lost sheep. At the heart of this was an effort to persuade them to abandon itinerancy and to live in a good Christian way. They became the subject of Roman Catholicism's mission to the other Indies. Elsewhere, it was their restless behaviour rather than their inherent being that became the focus of attention. The 17th century jurist and polymath Philip Camerarius called these gadders a rascally crew of cozeners and cheats who never came out of the East or other far countries. The claim that they counterfeited their identity as immigrants and chose to be itinerant justified their criminalisation by the English Tudor and Spanish Habsburg states in ways that denied them a distinct ethnic identity. Some scholars have seen this as a form of racial exclusion. The aura of distrust and suspicion that surrounded vagrants and gypsies is a sobering reminder of the concerns about transgressive mobility that run through early modern Christian history and which continue to challenge societies around the world today. This lecture has traced the many kinds of journeys, physical and mental, through which contemporaries gave expression to their religious convictions. It has teased out the confessionalisation of pilgrimage and probed the mixed feelings associated with the embodied experiences of travel. Mobility was spiritually revitalising, but it also provoked moral and social anxiety. Travel was embraced as a form of spiritual travail, but it was recurrently set in counterpoint to the settled state of labouring in a godly vocation. Emotional status symptomised a stagnant soul, but itinerancy was simultaneously surrounded by religious unease. The mental alienation of the pilgrim from worldly cares was paralleled by the social and physical alienation of the deviant poor. Motion occupied a contradictory and paradoxical place in post-Reformation culture. The next lecture takes up further aspects of this theme, opening a window into other lives in transit and comparing voluntary with coerced movement. It turns to the resonant topics of exile, migration, and convict and slave transportation.
Thank you, Professor Walsham. You've taken us further into this physical theology, and you've taken us from those incredible images of Mont Saint-Michel, which I know incredibly well, and as a Huguenot it's quite interesting to kind of go back to those histories. But also what I'm struck about is the continuities in your thinking, from the kind of historical Reformation moments to our contemporary spa, tourism and secularization. And that continuity is fascinating. And I think that the other element that I'm struck with is that locomotion is a mode of knowing, an acquisition of knowing. And that is a particular question that takes you back to the, if I may, the 1902 Gifford Lectures, where the one William James pointed out that if you want to change your mind, move your body. And you've integrated both that emotion and embodiment in the theological infrastructure. So thank you very much for that. We now have 20 minutes for questions, and apologies for those who are watching on live stream. Unfortunately, we can't take questions from you, but hopefully the richness of our audience here will answer some of your own questions. We have a mic, which Louise is carrying around. Thank you. Anybody would like to open our questions here at the front?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the wonderful journey which this lecture has been, as last one was also. The chair has so rightly stressed the continuity. I want to suggest that you need to include an older and longer continuity, not only in the medieval period, where, for example, the work of Chaucer and Langland must have had such tremendous impact on what produced Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, just as that in its own time was to inspire that very influential work, Louisa M. Alcott's Little Women, that there is a great continuity on these things. But I want to take it farther back to the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Holy Grail.
Absolutely.
I would think particularly in the Aeneid with the search for a patria, which in medieval thought, when they were using the Aeneid so much, patria was heaven, but patria was various other places to go to. And in particular, I'm thinking of the use of the Aeneid by Cotton Mather in his Magnalia Christi Americana, where the whole American subsequent experience, in a sense, was blocked out by the looking back, centuries back, into that tremendous tradition. So I would ask you, would you feel that your work must also involve returning to those antecedents?
Yes. Thank you very much. That's an excellent point. You will have seen that I try to crush a vast amount into one lecture, and of course that is an important dimension that I haven't really drawn out. But I suppose I would highlight, as came up at various points in this lecture, the close interweaving of humanism in the early modern period, of that revival of classical culture that is coinciding with the resurgence and the renewal of Christianity. And I think also what your points underline is the way in which the metaphor and the paradigm of the journey is not simply a Christian phenomenon, but a cross-cultural one and a cross-faith one as well. Thank you.
Question here.
Thank you very much. I was wondering where you feel the travel, I think that the latest point we looked into was the Grand Tour. Where would you say missionary travel moves into this sort of evolution of religious movement, where instead of you're traveling to a place to seek out relics of the past, you're bringing the knowledge to others? We touched on it with the exoticism, but where do you feel like that kind of movement takes over?
That's an excellent point, and I might sort of partly say that I'm going to cover the question of mission in the fourth lecture. So I'm going to pick up some of those points then. But I think in a way, one of the points I was trying to bring out today was that what becomes increasingly important in the Reformation context is not so much the destination, but the journey itself. And in a way, mission is part of that restless movement to, engage in an ongoing process of Christian renewal en route. So mission is a very important element of this, and often it is people who are, travelling, who are taken up with these questions of encounter with peoples of other faiths and cultures, and that stimulates and galvanizes both a kind of Christian impulse of mission, but also simultaneously those sorts of sentiments of difference, of spiritual superiority, but also of spiritual kind of compassion. Yeah.
Got one question here, and then we'll come to you after. We've got two questions.
Yes, well, thank you. That's a fascinating sort of wide sweep, and there's all sorts of thoughts that I'll go away with as a result of this lecture. So thanks very much. I've got a small question about the biblical geographies. I was fascinated by your pointing out the importance of these people who are trying to sort of pinpoint where the Garden of Eden is and so forth. And I was wondering if you could comment on the chronology of that. I've had a sense that sort of biblical chronology there's a sort of rise and fall of that. People try to work out exactly when the creation, and then sort of project that into the future, calculate when the second coming, etc. will be, and that becomes more important and then less important as 17th and 18th century comes on. Is the pinpointing of Eden and such like places, does that have a rise and fall?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know enough about its longer chronology, as it were. But I suppose what I would say is that I think one can see, and I guess continuity is one of the themes that I've tended to bring out, is
yes,
that,
in a sense, I'm being a bit unfair because I'm asking for something that you've been consciously trying to avoid.
But an example that I might give is that Matthew Parker, the Archbishop of Canterbury in Elizabeth's reign, is a great aficionado of sacred geographies, fascinated by these questions. The Bishop's Bible, which he's the sort of patron of, includes these peregrinations of St. Paul and so on. But he also collects in his manuscript collection, now in Corpus Christi, Cambridge, he collects medieval manuscripts that show journeys and itineraries to Jerusalem. So I think there is a much older tradition, and so much of our history thinks of the early modern period as a moment of rupture and of novelty. Actually, there's these long-standing traditions. That's already been brought out in an earlier question, and I think it's definitely true.
Thank you. Okay, question at the front here.
Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. I was reflecting on a group we sometimes know as the Pilgrim Fathers, and I was wondering where their movement fits into your schema. On one hand, you show the demonization of a group like the Roma people, and yet there's a converse, almost valorization in some parts of piety of this group of Puritans. Are they pilgrims? Is it a pilgrimage? How does this fit into your scheme of movement?
Absolutely. That's, of course, so much of the legend of the Pilgrim Fathers is a retrospective one that reflects a particular vision of the history of America. But, I think in a way I'm going to come to this in my next lecture about the ambivalence and the moral ambivalence associated with seeking exile, going into, exile, migrating, and the anxieties that surround that sort of rather complicate those triumphant visions of pilgrimage. And I think that language of pilgrimage and indeed of exile is a way of sort of reconciling a much more complicated set of feelings that are associated with it. It's a way of valorizing a much more ambivalent experience. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I wonder where travel for formal education and towards established institutions of learning, where these fit within your physical and theological landscapes. On the face of it, there ought to be both theological and spatial and other forms of continuity, but maybe you would.
Absolutely. I think, another theme that's been implicit here is the theme of the confessionalization of mobility. And that, of course, is linked with the confessionalization of space. I think where you can see that most clearly is in the travel of Protestants and Catholics to places and institutions of learning across Europe. So, there's a kind of movement that reinforces exactly those forms of institutionalized religious identity that are emerging. And when people decide to leave, to go into exile, actually often they can explain that as a form of, I'm going to educate myself. They disguise themselves as tourists. They also disguise themselves as spa travelers as well. They're just going for my health, really, yeah. And they're going for their spiritual health in a way. And so the ambiguities of the reasons and the motivations for travel are getting caught up in this world in which religious mobility is becoming shaped by these confessionalizing paradigms. Yeah.
Question?
Thank you for another excellent lecture. I was interested in whether you could say something about developing senses of ownership, because of course travel requires a certain freedom to move across space and certain access to resource, and it can be a motivation, travel for material gain. And so whether, coming back to an earlier question, that slight contrast between pilgrim fathers and vagrants has something to do with the sort of post-match valorization of those who go and get stuff.
Yes, sorry, could you just to give me the gist of the question again? Yeah.
Really, you've talked about movement as a means to spiritual gain. You've talked about movement as a means for the poor. It might be forced upon them in order to gain material effect. But actually, those with power over space, who owns what, and the materials to move, and they move to gain stuff, and are then valorized as pilgrim fathers in quiet contrast to the vagrants. And so it's whether during that period, travel is also developing our views of property and ownership.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. I think perhaps where that comes into focus most clearly is around changing regimes of poor relief, whereby increasingly your entitlement to poor relief is linked with your residence in a particular location. And that is both a means of exerting power, and it's tied up with this powerful sense that itinerant movement, purposeless itinerant movement, is subversive and seditious, and it is not a form of activity that justifies giving you forms of relief. So I think there is definitely an emerging politics of movement linked with senses of political disorder. Yeah.
Got a question here in the middle.
Thank you for two excellent lectures. A lot of what you're describing today has been to do with journeys of the mind and the emotion and the imagination. This is being played out against a world in which there's the development of systematic science, systematic land surveying, and actually the first accurate representations of the world. Yeah. How do these two things fit together?
Well, I think they're interrelated. I mean, the maps that I was showing earlier, the maps of Paul's peregrinations, are in the style of the cartography of the period. One is very struck also by the preoccupation, and it predates the early modern period, with measuring. Measurement is an important dimension of devotion. Measuring the Virgin's foot, measuring the distance travelled, measuring how many steps it takes to go round a shrine, and so on. And so I think that, again, we often tend to sort of set up science against devotion. Actually, they're really closely intertwined throughout the period. That was really, the theme of my last lecture, and it's also a theme in the background in the background here. Thank you.
Question at the front.
Hi, thanks so much. My question is, can I ask two? Is that forbidden? One is that, when was it that, because now Protestants talk about that movement of the Holy Spirit in relation to emotions, and I wonder, when does that language appear? Is that happening already now? And then the other question is, how much do Christians in Europe know about the Hajj? And do they know that Muslims are also making pilgrimages? Yeah. And how does that intermix with what you were saying about this kind of Orientalist vision from further afield? Exactly. Travels?
Yeah, they absolutely are talking about the movement of the Spirit. This is so pervasive in the way. And, I think when I was thinking about my theme, I started to be attentive to that language of movement. And when you start looking for it, you find it absolutely everywhere. And I think what I was trying to say yesterday is that language of movement is tied up with a really powerful understanding of the literal movements that take place inside the body and soul, and the heart. The other question about, sorry, just tell me again.
How much did Christians in Europe know
about
the Hajj?
Yeah, indeed. They did know about that. And I think, again, you can see how their view of what they see as a deviant religious system and the movements and the mobility associated with that are then constructed in terms of the disorderly mobility that they, are criticizing, vagrancy, etc. So they're adopting that same language to describe, the Hajj, but they're also, they're fascinated by that in an ethnographic way as well. But that ethnography is always tinged with, this sort of sense of difference and hostility.
We've got a question here. Mike's up.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for two excellent lectures. I mean, one thing I was just wondering about, in speaking about pilgrimage in this lecture, the pilgrimage you've generally focused on have been sort of quite gentle affairs. But if one reflects upon that period, a number of major pilgrimages of a very different nature, namely the Crusades, would have animated a number of people. But how does that type of pilgrimage, that sort of journeying, the end of which is not such a gentle end as some of the pilgrimage. How does that fit into your overall picture?
Absolutely. I mean, although the sort of age of real crusading is earlier, it is an era in which the Ottoman Empire is knocking on the door of Europe. They're reaching, Vienna. They're on the outskirts of Vienna in the 17th century. And so that language and that sense of crusading and of military movement is still very much in their thinking. And in a later lecture, I will come to some more of those violent movements that actually often adopt the language and then the mentality of crusade as well. So I hope you'll be willing to wait for then.
Another question.
I'll cheekily ask another question, if I may. I wonder how much you put up a very interesting slide of a wonderful box of tricks, a box of stones and bits and pieces owned by, I'm assuming, a Danish Lutheran. And that kind of provokes the question, how much, and appreciating that the interiority of all of this is quite difficult to recapture. But I'm wondering how much these souvenirs function as spiritual aids actually across the confessional divide, and souvenirs of this kind act as a form of spiritual prop for those whose formal theology actually runs counter to the use of such physical bolsters of faith.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the whole question of, how individuals think about the function of the object in their faith is another whole question that one could explore. But it's really interesting, for example, how medieval sacred objects such as relics find their way into the collections of, cabinets of curiosities and early museums, and they're the source of a kind of fascination and even a kind of antiquarian veneration. So I think that there is the potential for those things to have, coexisting meanings, and something that a devout Protestant picks up and interacts with can have, a different significance for a Catholic. But, again, Protestantism is not a faith that repudiates the material object. It reconfigures the meaning of those in complex ways. It's more a kind of mnemonic, though actually some of the ways in which people interact with objects are highly reminiscent of, relic culture of the past. Yeah.
We have time, I think, just for one more question, if anybody has any final reflection. Okay, sorry.
Thank you very much for that. I was just thinking about Loretto.
Sorry, mic come.
Thank you very, very much for that. I was just thinking about Loretto and how much fun that is, because I mainly know about it in the 19th century and now. But is there an extent, as there kind of is now, I mean, intellectual Catholics now who make a big deal out of the flying house of Loretto do it partly, well, I don't want to say to annoy Protestants, but do it very much in a self-conscious way of this is, on the face of it, ridiculous. But what it does is sort of jump over a kind of rational, you're peasants. The Gospels belong to us because we can read and they don't belong to you. And it sort of jumps that to domestic kind of single setting, potentially. I mean, it certainly does in the 19th century in sort of Ireland, is what I'm thinking of. Is that also true in the 16th, 17th century? Is it something that you sort of, part of the attraction is it gets you past the annoying literate upper classes to a kind of Mary and Jesus belong with us?
That's really interesting. I mean, one part of what you said there struck a chord with me, and I think, perhaps I could have brought out more clearly how much the Protestant discourse against pilgrimage is a rationalizing discourse. It's also a discourse that says it's highly emotional forms of piety that are excessive, etc. So it actually sets up that tension between reason and emotion that we've inherited and that I'm really trying to dismantle here. Yeah. I'm not quite sure about the other question, but I think that is an element of it. I mean, by the late 17th, 18th century, there's a kind of sense within European society that there are the vulgar people and there are the learned, and I think that these sorts of devotions are being inflected by those forms of social polarization that are taking place and taking on some of this language of both reason and emotion to demarcate them. Yeah.
But it kind of cuts both ways, doesn't it? You intellectuals don't get this.
Yeah. It's much harder for us as historians to get at that, of course, because literate people leave most of the historical records. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I think the range of the questions and the multiple locations of those questions reflect the richness of what you are able to bring out in these religious histories. And I've really appreciated the complexity of what movement is in its historical forms and the way the spiritual imagination transforms that. And you've set us up wonderfully in these first two lectures. For the next lectures to come, just to reiterate, this is the second of 6. So thank you very much for all the rich insights that you brought this evening. And can we appreciate Professor Walsham's contributions? Before we finish this evening, I just want to say a few words of thanks. I want to say thanks to the chair of the Gifford Committee, David Smith, and to Louise Kelly, who's been the framework of organising the Gifford Lectures. Thank you very much. I want to thank our video team who've been working hard, correcting and leading us through the experience. So thank you very much for that. Thank you all for attending this evening, and thank you all those who've attended the live stream. Please do come along to all of the other lectures. I think that if we bear in mind Professor Walsham's lectures, that one thing that we've understood is that a journey requires concentration and an opening to the endurance of travel. And the 6 lectures get deeper and deeper, just like a walk in any environment. The longer you go through that walk, the greater commitment you give to that walk, the greater the experience. And I look forward to the next steps on that journey. Thank you, Professor Walsham.